Hi folks, my name is Cynthia Walker. I'm the Brickstore Museum's Executive Director, and in an effort to bring some enjoyment to the quarantined days ahead, the staff at the museum thought we would do some digital lectures. So when you're sitting around your house and are finished with every inch of cleaning and every chore you could possibly think of, and you don't want to have to do any more work on your computer, we thought you might want to turn on one of these lectures to talk about Kennebunk's history and culture. So I will say that obviously I am coming to you from my home here in Kennebunk. I'll also note that my dog Murtaugh is here with me, so she likes to bark, especially when I am speaking, so we will see how long we get before she starts to bark. So for now, I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I can get it here. And instead of everybody looking at my face, especially me, I don't want to be watching that, I will turn my face off and then I'll put up our slides and welcome you to Vitamin B, How Food Fought the Second World War. And this digital lecture is based off of an exhibit that the museum did in 2014 that took a look at obviously how food fought the Second World War, and it featured a lot of our propaganda posters in that exhibit. And one note that I'll say is that the museum proudly owns the largest collection of propaganda posters in New England. So when we're all back to normal, I invite you to stop into the museum and make an appointment if you'd ever like to take a look at those posters. They are really interesting to look at. Food is universal. It is something that everyone needs and everyone understands. Situations that make it plentiful or scarce often surround major events in history. During World War II, food was considered a weapon. It could be used to feed soldiers and families to strengthen our resolve, but it could also be used and withheld from enemy forces to weaken their abilities. Families on the American home front during the 1940s were active participants in the war. Food, fuel, and other materials supported 17.8 million American troops that served in all branches of the military from 1941 through 1945, which meant those on the home front stretched, substituted, rationed, and really made do with less. Not only were materials used in war effort, but American production of those same materials and products plummeted due to labor shortages as the result of millions of men left the workforce to join the war. Raising an armed force and feeding themselves and their allies signaled a fundamental change in America. The home front war effort required sacrifice and cooperation. That meant all Americans conserved resources, volunteered for civilian defense, and rationed food and other important materials. The American government focused its efforts on making families at home feel as though their sacrifices were just as important to winning the war as those made by the men on the front lines. Every scrap was saved, every meal was planned out, and nothing was wasted. Emotionally charged propaganda posters, like the ones that you'll see in this slideshow, as well as government leaflets, were the chief ingredient in spreading the word. So let's look a little bit about the war in general. Nearly 40% of US servicemen and women volunteered for the military during the war. Another 60% were drafted. The average base pay for an enlisted man was a little bit above $71 a month, which with officers receiving an average of about $203 a month. After the United States joined the fight against Germany and Japan in 1941, nearly the whole world was at war. Europe had been embroiled in the same fight since 1939. Nearly 80,000 Mainers served in World War II, more than any previous war, and over 2,100 Maine soldiers died in service to their country, including 206 men from York County alone. In the early 20th century, the Committee on Public Information realized an important hurdle to advertising in America. The printed word was not often read, and newsreels could be ignored. So how could the US spread information? The billboard was something that caught even the most indifferent eye. Propaganda posters, especially, were created during World War I and II to target and rally reluctant citizens to embrace the sacrifices demanded of them during those years. In an era before the internet, before widespread radio, and before television, these brightly colored, highly visual posters were critical to spreading the word. The Committee on Public Information wasted no time. In 1941, government officials incorporated the poster medium into their plans to convert the American economy to all-out war production. They realized that they needed the best artists in the country to create these posters to win over the American public. Artists, illustrators, and media specialists flocked to the government's war effort. The main goal of the program was to transform every person from being an observer to being an active participant. Voluntary cooperation rather than coercion always works better. Owning a share in America meant a lot more than monetary investment. American citizens had just been revived from the Great Depression and before that World War I, so these posters really mobilized the nation into action. The nice thing about posters is that they were inexpensive to create and ever present, so they hung everywhere. Thousands were issued by the government, by businesses, and by private organizations, all working to link the military front to the home front. Not all citizens were on board with the sacrifices required, so posters and messaging were often the emotional charge that inspired shifts in their judgment. Imagery was direct and sometimes frightening, like the ones that you're seeing here on your screen, and these posters mobilized everybody to make sure that every US citizen was considered a combatant. So the home, the farm, and the factory were all arenas of war. Kennebunk prepared for war like many towns across the nation did. Kennebunkers were active as air raid observers. In 1942, Chief Observer Carl Spiller required at least 45 women to join the corps of 45 men. These observers reported for 2 hours of duty to watch for the approach of airplanes. Excuse me. One of Kennebunk's observation stations, which is pictured here on your screen, stood at what is now the I-95 overpass on Cat-Mousom Road. The other observatory sat atop the Pythian Block building on Main Street. So that building now has Main Street Barbershop and the Blue in the bottom floor of it. In other preparation efforts, the Public Health Association was in search of places for an emergency hospital, and they ended up selecting the Webb-Hinnock Golf Course's clubhouse as their makeshift hospital. Beach patrols on the town's beaches had citizens watching for enemy approached by water. By the end of the war, there were several known German U-boats off the coast of Maine. So now we look at your fair share. The US government formed several oversight organizations to help educate and organize civilians in their duties during the war, especially regarding food, conservation, and rationing. The War Ration Board was established in 1942. Every town, including Kennebunk, had one, and that allowed civilians to register for ration stamps for meat, fuel, sugar, flour, and other things. On your screen right now, you can see a variety of different things. So there's ration stamps with certain numbers on them. There's a close-up look at a ration coupon for 5 points. that could be used for meat, fats, fish, and cheese. And then in the top right corner, you can see what was the front of a war ration book. So the stamps that you see on the left would be in that book. Kennebunk native George Wentworth managed the rationing board in York County. Rationing meant that Americans had to get creative with cooking. Sugarless cookies, eggless cakes, and meatless meals were the order of the day. With less food to go around, the US government guaranteed that everyone get at least a share of the food and the fuel by giving out ration stamps. The War Food Administration formed in 1943 to direct the production and distribution of food to meet war needs and essential civilian needs. The office determined the amount of food available for civilian use and then rationed it to make sure that everyone received their fair share. An interesting note on this portion of our program is that the War Food Administration is responsible for the creation of the school lunch program in the United States, obviously, which is still around today. The reason they created it in the 1940s was because the country realized that so many young men who were either drafted or volunteering for the military were rejected from military service based on poor nutrition. So Congress passed the National School Lunch Act in 1946 as a measure of national security. So we have them to thank for that continuing benefit for schools today. Rationing existed to make sure all Americans received their fair share after the demands of the military were supplied. Without rationing, a war-short supply would soon be depleted by a few people, as opposed to everyone getting some. Sugar was one of the first consumer goods to be rationed during the war, though it would come to include items such as coffee, meat, butter, tires, and gasoline. I don't think I speak out of turn when I say those items on your screen are certainly things that we take for granted nowadays. That's certainly something that we can't do without. Because of the demands on farmers and food manufacturers by the military, prices for everyday items increased. To combat the rise in cost, the government instituted top legal prices for each everyday food item and required restaurants, groceries, and other food service locations to report on their costs for each category of food. Ration books were awarded to every individual of a household, so that means, adults through children and babies. Every individual got one. And it was up to the homemaker, who was usually the mother in the 1940s, to pool the stamps together and plan the family's meals within the set limits of what she could buy with the collected stamps. So Kennebunk and other towns held registration days in order to get a proper count of the amount of ration books that were needed by each family. There were 5 registration centers in Kennebunk, which were made up of 4 elementary schools and the town hall. If you missed a registration day, then you had to wait until the next month when you could register again and receive your war ration books. So let's get down into how rationing with that point system actually worked. Each person, again, adults, children, babies, started with 48 blue points, which were for processed foods, and then 64 red points, which were for meat, fish, and dairy, each month. For every month, a new set of ration stamps were handed out at that registration day as the old ones expired. Each stamp had a number on it to designate the points it was worth, as well as a letter showing for which rationing period the stamp could be used. So let me go back a couple here, and you can see on the left side of your screen those ration stamps with their numbers, as well as up close in the bottom right, Again, that one was worth 5 points, for instance. So each rationed product had a point value system assigned to it that was independent of the price. The point value would fluctuate depending on scarcity, and grocers were required to keep official point lists or values posted, so you could decide if you could afford it or not. At the checkout counter, the shopper was to remove the proper amount of stamps in the presence of the clerk, and then manage their points effectively to make sure that they had enough stamps to remain them, or to use the rest of the month. So by 1944, evolving regulations resulted in a simplified plan that introduced kind of 1 point tokens that could be given as change and all the rest. So that means when buying food at the market or anywhere else that required ration stamps to be used, shoppers approached the checkout counter with both money and ration stamps. The grocer would ring up the purchases, give the dollar amount plus a stamp amount that was needed to purchase the rationed items. Shoppers would then receive their change back in both cash and in stamps, or tokens if the stamp, change was less than $1. To dive into that a little further, just because I know when I was originally trying to go over this, it was still a little bit confusing. We'll give you, for instance, where you are at the market purchasing steak, juice, eggs, and flour. The grocer tells you the total is $9.60, but then he'll also tell you that for the steak, eggs, and flour, that is $4.60 in meat ration points, and then $2 in flour ration points. So you could hand him a $10 bill for the $9.60 cash that you owe, and then take out your ration book to tear out $5 worth of meat ration stamps and $2 of your flour ration stamps. Grocer would then hand you back 40 cents in the coin change, and then 40 cents in tokens for the unused meat ration points. If you didn't have enough stamps to cover the total needed, I think all of us might wonder this, is, what if you didn't have any more stamps? If you didn't have the stamps, you couldn't buy it. Lost stamp books, for example, were a headache for those who had misplaced them. And even if you had money to buy, bread or meat or anything like that, if you didn't have the stamps, you were not allowed to buy it. So think about that. So after all of that, are you still feeling confused? I think this will make you feel better in that a lot of Americans in the 1940s were confused. One interesting entry that I found from the Kennebunk Star newspaper, they had printed a Gallup poll that was taken on March 5th, 1943, which asked Americans, do you understand how the food point rationing system works? Again, this is in 1943, so right in the middle of the rationing system. Did they understand how it worked? Only 53% of men answered yes, while 76% of women answered yes. So I will leave that to you to make up your mind on what that says about organization. The government issued 4 ration books over the period of the war, as well as the ration coins for making that change that we were talking about a few minutes ago. All food establishments, including restaurants, hospitals, and schools, were also subject to rationing, but did not use ration books like civilian homes did. Customers would pay for meals, but not use ration stamps. So food service issues included labor shortages, something called meat fixing, which was the fact that many times the best cuts of meat went to fancy hotels and not to the supermarkets. And then, of course, slower business overall. So fewer families could afford to eat out in the 1940s. During peacetime, 100% of food went to civilians. During the war, 75% of the supply went to civilians, while 13% went to the armed forces and 10% was sent by the United States to our allied nations. Everyone had to make their meals stretch the week, often practicing conservation techniques like meatless dinners, and citizens in Kennebunk and throughout the nation were encouraged to install victory gardens in their backyards to supplement these rationed goods. Whatever you grew, you could keep. In addition to growing their own vegetables, Kennebunk citizens also went clamming, fishing, and hunting to add to their family's food supply. Through oral histories that we've done, with citizens from the 1940s, dandelion greens and berries we know were also a popular thing to go find in the fields. And then farmers that owned chickens sold the majority of their eggs to the government for the war effort, but would sell cracked eggs, like the kind we throw away today, to citizens who ran out of ration stamps. The kitchen became a source for war production. At home, that is. Because electric refrigerators were just becoming popular, they were very expensive, and most people in Kennebunk didn't own one. The metal used to make these refrigerators was also rationed. Most metal went straight to the war, so not many refrigerators were even being made during this time. So what did people use to keep their food cold or cool? They used ice boxes. Ice delivery would occur every day in the summer months, and then less frequently, obviously, during the winter. So on this slide, this shows an image of part of our exhibit when it was up in 2014, just of a little setting of a kitchen, featuring what a kitchen may have looked like at that time. The Women's Land Army, which you can see in this poster, was a federally established organization from 1943 to 1947. It existed to recruit and train women to work on farms that had been left untended due to the labor drain that arose during the war. Since 1940, nearly 6 million farm laborers had left the fields for either higher-paying wartime factory jobs or military service. Crops were in danger of literally rotting in the fields because there was nobody there to pick it. So at the same time that America needed more food to support both the military and civilian life, farm labor was nearly gone. By 1943, Congress realized this and allocated funds to create the Emergency Farm Labor Service, which included the Women's Land Army, which recruited over 1 million female workers. Women received unskilled laborers' wages, which at that time was about 25 cents to 40 cents an hour. And out of that, they paid for their denim overall uniforms, their meals, and their lodging. Victory gardeners produced over 10 billion, that's billion, pounds of food in 1943 alone, and over 1/3 of all fresh vegetables in the country. In 1943, a typical American family wasted 1 out of every 4 pounds of food, so a tiny amount. And by 2014, this amount was at least doubled. So we all have to watch our food conservation. On our website, I'm going to be uploading 1943's 1 Dozen Hints on Food Conservation for you to take a look at, plus some other resources on victory gardening that you can undertake today, even though it was written in the 1940s. The Brickstore Museum is excited because we're going to be expanding our own victory garden this year. We've had one since this exhibit in 2014, and then this year, thanks to a grant by Seed Money, we've been able to double the gardening space that we've had in the past 6 years now. So we're excited because all of the food that's grown in our gardens, we use it as an educational space, obviously, to talk about this very topic of food conservation and food in general in the 1940s. But the food that's actually grown there is all donated to community outreach services here in Kennebunk. So I encourage you to visit our website, www.brickstoremuseum.org, for more educational resources on World War II, to check out our large war propaganda poster collection, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, and also discover more lectures just like this one.